Some names echo through history like a thunderclap. Roosevelt. The name conjures images of charging up San Juan Hill, of fireside chats, of a political dynasty that shaped the very course of America. And at the heart of that dynasty was a woman as sharp and brilliant as a diamond, Theodore Roosevelt's firstborn, the legendary Alice Roosevelt Longworth. She was a force of nature, a wit, a rebel, a woman who dominated Washington society for over half a century. Her story is one of power and influence. But this is not her story. This is the story of the quiet, tragic secret at the center of her glittering world. It's the story of her daughter, a girl born of a scandalous affair, raised in the shadow of a mother who was a national monument and destined for a life of quiet sorrow. She was the ghost at the banquet of a great American family, a footnote in a famous biography whose own life was a heartbreaking poem left unfinished. This is the forgotten story of Paulina Longworth Sturm. To understand Paulina, you have to imagine the Washington, D.C. of the Roaring Twenties. This wasn't just the nation's capital. It was a pulsating hub of power, ambition, and secrets. Prohibition was the law of the land, but the cocktail glasses in the private homes of the powerful were never empty. Jazz music spilled out of smoky speakeasies, and the old stuffy rules of society were being gleefully shattered. At the absolute epicenter of this cynical, glittering world was the Salon at 2009 Massachusetts Avenue, the home of Alice Roosevelt Longworth. Alice, the daughter of a beloved former president and the wife of the powerful Speaker of the House, Nicholas Longworth, presided over Washington like a mischievous queen. Her home was the place where senators and Supreme Court justices, ambassadors, and journalists all came to trade gossip, forge alliances, and pay their respects to the wittiest and most feared woman in town. It was a world of adults, a world of sharp elbows and even sharper tongues, a world of performative brilliance where sentimentality was a weakness and emotional vulnerability was a fatal flaw. It was into this thrilling but emotionally barren landscape that a baby girl was born, a child who was, by her very nature, the opposite of everything this world valued. Paulina Longworth was born on Valentine's Day, 1925, and her arrival was immediately shrouded in mystery and scandal. Her mother, the formidable Alice Roosevelt Longworth, was 41 years old and had been in a famously cool, almost platonic and often separate lives marriage to Nicholas Longworth for 19 years. The sudden appearance of a miracle baby after nearly 2 decades of childlessness raised more than a few eyebrows. In the whispering corridors of Washington, where secrets were currency, it was the worst-kept secret in town that Paulina's biological father was not the doting, publicly proud Nicholas Longworth, but rather the powerful, brilliant, and notoriously unfaithful senator from Idaho, William Borah. Alice herself, with her typical cutting wit, only added fuel to the fire. When asked about her daughter's paternity, she would often just smile enigmatically. The rumor was so widespread that she even gave her daughter a nickname that was a nod to Borah's famous moniker, the Lion of Idaho. Paulina grew up as the living embodiment of this secret, while Nicholas Longworth, who absolutely adored her and called her his one and only, was the only father she ever officially knew. The unspoken truth of her parentage hung in the air around her. It was a foundational crack in the very structure of her identity, a silent question mark at the center of her being. She was a Longworth in name, a Roosevelt by blood, and secretly a Borah by conception. Imagine the confusion for a young, sensitive child, navigating a world where the man everyone called her father was a source of endless affection, while her mother, the person she was supposed to be closest to, remained a figure of distant, almost clinical observation. The emotional wires of her young life were crossed from the very beginning. Her childhood was a study in profound gilded loneliness. Her home on Massachusetts Avenue was constantly filled with the most important people in the country, their booming voices and clouds of cigar smoke filling the formal rooms. It was not a child-friendly space. It was a stage for her mother's brilliant social theater. And Alice, the star of the show, was a dazzling hostess and a political animal. But she had absolutely no instinct for motherhood. She was famously, almost proudly, detached. She once described children as a rather unattractive stage in the development of the human race. Of her own daughter, in a quote that sends a shiver down the spine, she made the chillingly clinical remark that having Paulina was a calculated risk. Alice provided for her daughter's every material need, the finest clothes, the best nannies, the most exclusive schools, but the emotional warmth, the gentle maternal affection that a child craves more than anything, was simply not there. Paulina was an accessory in her mother's life, a doll to be dressed up and presented, but not a child to be cuddled and comforted. Tragedy struck when Paulina was just 6 years old. Nicholas Longworth, the kind, doting man who had given her his name and his unconditional love, died suddenly of pneumonia. His death was a devastating blow. It removed the primary source of warmth and stability from her young life, leaving her solely in the care of her brilliant but emotionally remote mother. With Longworth gone, the one person who had provided a buffer between Paulina's gentle soul and Alice's sharp edges was gone forever. The house on Massachusetts Avenue, which had at least held the echo of his laughter, now became a colder, quieter place for a lonely little girl. From an early age, it was clear that Paulina was the temperamental opposite of Alice. Where Alice was audacious, rebellious, and thrived on attention, Paulina was timid, sensitive, and craved anonymity. Where Alice was sharp and sarcastic, Paulina was gentle and yearned for harmony. It was a classic psychological dynamic. The daughter of a famous rebel became a quiet, almost desperate conformist. She wanted nothing more than to live a normal, conventional life, a life that was the very antithesis of the one she had been born into. She went to the best schools, had a formal debutante ball, and followed the prescribed path of a well-bred young woman of her class, all in a quiet search for the normalcy her chaotic, emotionally barren childhood lacked. She was the calm at the center of her mother's hurricane, a soft-spoken girl in a house of loud opinions. In 1944, during the height of World War II, it seemed she had finally found her escape. At the age of 19, she married Alexander Sturm. Alex was in many ways her perfect counterpart. He was handsome, brilliant, and artistic, a graduate of Yale from a well-connected family. He was a writer, an artist, and the co-founder, along with William Ruger, of what would become the famous firearms company Sturm, Ruger, and Company. For a time, it seemed Paulina had finally found the happiness and stability she had always craved. They had a daughter, Joanna, in 1946, and settled into a life far from the political crucible of Washington. In Alex, Paulina had found a partner who valued her gentle nature and provided the loving, stable home she had never known. But the fragile peace she had so carefully constructed was about to be shattered by another devastating tragedy. The life Paulina built with Alex Sturm was her quiet rebellion. It was a rebellion not of loud protest and broken rules like her mother's, but of gentle domesticity. They settled in Westport, Connecticut, a world away from the cynical political games of Washington, D.C. Their home was a sanctuary of art, literature, and the quiet joys of a life lived for each other. Here, in the calm of New England, She created the warmth and genuine affection that had been so absent from her own childhood. By all accounts, she was a deeply devoted and loving mother to her daughter, Joanna. While Alice had outsourced the messy business of child rearing to a staff of nannies, Paulina was a hands-on parent, finding in her daughter a sense of purpose and a chance for the unconditional love she had always sought. It was as if she was determined to break the cycle of emotional neglect, to give her own child the one thing she had never received from Alice. Her relationship with her mother, however, remained a study in distance. Alice, ever the unsentimental observer, watched her daughter's conventional life with a kind of detached, almost clinical amusement. When Paulina was a child, Alice had famously refused to let her call her mother, insisting on the formal Mrs. L in public and Alice in private. This emotional gulf never truly closed. At Paulina's debutante ball, a rite of passage she undertook to please society, Alice was heard to remark with a sigh, "I have no daughter, I have a debutante." To Alice, Paulina's gentle nature and her desire for a normal life were a constant, unspoken rebuke to her own cynical worldview, and Alice's sharp wit, the very thing that made her a legend in Washington, often felt like a weapon to her sensitive daughter. The brief 7-year period of her marriage to Alex was likely the happiest of her life. He was her partner, her intellectual equal, and her protector. He gave her a world of her own, away from the long shadow of the Roosevelts and the crushing weight of her mother's fame. But in 1951, this sanctuary was destroyed. Alex, who had suffered from a chronic case of viral hepatitis, died suddenly in the hospital. He was only 28 years old. Paulina was just 26, a widow with a 5-year-old daughter. The loss was catastrophic. The walls of the beautiful, safe world she had so carefully constructed came crashing down around her. It not only robbed her of her husband, but it also plunged her back into the emotional orbit of her formidable mother. She was adrift, and the darkness that had always hovered at the edges of her life began to close in. She struggled profoundly in the years that followed. She was plagued by a deep, unrelenting depression, anxiety, and chronic insomnia. Eventually she surrendered, moving back to Washington to live near her mother, not for comfort, but for a semblance of family structure. She became a ghost at her mother's salon, a sad, quiet presence at the edge of the glittering parties, a constant, uncomfortable reminder of a world of grief that Alice refused to acknowledge. Alice, who had faced her own share of tragedy with a steely, almost unnerving stoicism, seemed utterly incapable of providing the comfort and support her grieving daughter so desperately needed. Biographers note that Alice grew impatient with Paulina's prolonged sorrow, viewing it as a sign of weakness. Instead of a hug, she offered her trademark biting wit and unsentimental advice, which was like offering a stone to a starving person. Paulina's final years were a quiet, desperate search for peace. She relied heavily on sleeping pills to get through the lonely nights. Her friends watched, helpless, as she seemed to fade, consumed by a sorrow that she could never fully articulate, a sorrow born of a lifetime of unspoken truths and unrequited love. The girl who had everything was, in the end, utterly alone with her pain. The story of Paulina Longworth Sturm is a quiet one, largely free of the public political controversies that defined her family. The controversies surrounding her were deeply personal, whispered in the salons of Washington and hidden in the pages of private diaries. The central, unavoidable debate revolves around the circumstances of her birth. The fact that Senator William Borah was her biological father is now widely accepted by historians and biographers of the Roosevelt family. It was the original sin of her life, a secret that was not a secret at all. This creates a complex and painful historical question. What was the true impact of being the public daughter of one man while being the biological but unacknowledged daughter of another? It created a profound sense of genealogical bewilderment, a feeling of being an imposter in her own life, of not truly belonging to the very family whose name she carried. It placed her in an impossible psychological position. Nicholas Longworth, the father of her heart, loved her dearly but was not her father by blood. William Borah, the father of her blood, was a powerful man she saw at social functions, but he could never claim her, never offer her the love or acknowledgement a daughter deserves. This tragic, cruel symmetry at the very root of her existence surely contributed to her lifelong feelings of insecurity and sadness. This wasn't just a simple secret, it was a daily reality, a web of polite fictions she was forced to navigate every single day of her childhood in the cruel, knowing world of Washington society. Paulina Longworth Sturm lived and died as a footnote to a more famous story. She published no books, made no speeches, and held no office. And yet, her quiet, tragic life has a profound and lasting significance. Her story serves as a powerful and heartbreaking counter-narrative to the myth of the great American political dynasties. While we are often captivated by the glamour and power of families like the Roosevelts and the Kennedys, Paulina's life reveals the dark side of that legacy. It shows the immense, often invisible pressure placed on the children born in the shadows of great men and women. It reminds us that behind the public facade of power and confidence often lies a world of private pain, secrets, and profound emotional neglect. A more painful debate, and one that cuts to the very heart of this story, concerns Alice's role as a mother. Was she, as the press of her day often hinted, and later biographers have explored, a bad mother? By the cold material standards of her time and class, she was not. Paulina was always perfectly dressed, sent to the finest schools, and wanted for nothing that money could buy. But the emotional void at the center of her life was vast and consuming. Alice's defenders might argue that she was a product of her own time and her own profound foundational tragedy. Her own mother, Alice Lee, had died giving birth to her. Perhaps she was simply incapable of giving the maternal love she herself had never known, a victim of a generational trauma that she then passed down to her own daughter. But critics, and there are many, point to a pattern of narcissistic self-involvement and a chilling, lifelong lack of empathy. Alice's witty but cruel remarks about her own daughter are well documented and still have the power to shock. When a friend gushed that the infant Paulina was beautiful, Alice famously retorted with a shrug, "Yes, but it has no political influence." She treated Paulina's conventional desires for a husband and family not with warmth, but with a kind of intellectual contempt, as if her daughter's yearning for a normal life was a personal failing. The debate, then, is not whether Alice loved her daughter in her own guarded, deeply unsentimental way she likely did, but whether that love was so filtered through her own massive, glittering ego that it was unrecognizable and utterly inaccessible to the child who needed it most. This profound emotional void left a wound that never truly healed, casting a long, dark shadow that extended to the very end of Paulina's life. On January 26, 1957, that shadow finally consumed her. She was found dead in her Washington, D.C. home, discovered by a friend who had grown worried after not hearing from her. The cause was an overdose of sleeping pills. She was only 31 years old. The official coroner's report was swift and discreet, ruling her death an accident. It was a plausible explanation, at least on the surface. Paulina was a known insomniac, deeply plagued by anxiety and the grief from her husband's death. It was easy to imagine her, in the lonely hours of the night, simply misjudging the dosage, taking one pill too many in a desperate search for sleep. This was the cleaner, less scandalous version of the story, the one that allowed the powerful Roosevelt and Longworth names to avoid the stain of suicide. But a darker question has always lingered over the story, a persistent whisper that will not be silenced. Was it truly an accident? Or was it the final desperate act of a woman who could no longer bear the weight of her own sadness? Those close to her knew the depth of her depression, a sorrow that seemed to have settled into her bones. Her life had been a series of profound losses. The early death of the only father figure who showed her consistent affection, the shattering loss of her beloved husband, and the lifelong gaping absence of her mother's love. Was the overdose a tragic mistake made by a woman overwhelmed by insomnia and grief? Or was it the final quiet surrender of a woman who had simply run out of the strength to keep fighting? We will never know for sure. The ambiguity of her final moments is a heartbreaking reflection of the ambiguity that defined her entire tragic life. She is also a timeless and poignant case study in the complex and often painful dynamics between mothers and daughters, particularly when the mother is a larger-than-life, narcissistic figure. Paulina's lifelong struggle to find her own identity while living in the shadow of her famous, formidable mother is a story that resonates on a deeply human level. Her life is a testament to the deep and lasting wounds that can be inflicted by an emotionally unavailable parent, and the desperate, often tragic search for the love that was withheld. Her legacy also lives on quietly through her daughter, Joanna. After Paulina's death, Joanna was raised by her grandmother, the famously unconventional Alice. Joanna Sturm, in what can be seen as the ultimate tribute to her mother's quiet nature, has lived her entire life as a deeply private citizen, successfully avoiding the spotlight that so tormented her mother and grandmother. The story of Paulina and her daughter is a story of a legacy transformed from one of glaring, often cruel publicity to one of quiet, dignified privacy. Paulina's significance then lies in her quietness, in her tragedy, in her representation of the person who is forgotten in the grand sweep of history. She matters because her story forces us to look past the famous names and the powerful titles, to see the fragile human being who is often paying the price for all that greatness. In the end, Paulina Longworth Sturm remains a ghost, a whisper in the loud, boisterous history of the Roosevelt family. She was the girl born of a secret, who lived her life in the shadow of a mother who was a sun so bright it cast everyone around it into darkness. She craved a simple, normal life, a life of quiet love and gentle affection. But she was born into a world that had no time for such things. Her short life was a search for an anchor in a stormy sea, a search for warmth in a house that was emotionally cold. She found it for a brief and shining moment in her marriage and in her own experience of motherhood, only to have it snatched away by fate.